Hey there, Humo soldiers. I'm just reminding you of the enhanced experience of listening to Human Monsters, namely Human Monsters Premium. The link is included in the notes of this episode. What you get with your membership are exclusive episodes available only on Premium, such as this week's episode about the Casanova killer, Paul John Knowles. He was a human monster par excellence. Murder, kidnapping, rape, pedophilia. He was a nasty piece of work. You'll also get early bird releases, which are published as soon as the episodes are locked. You get Misanthropology e-magazine for free, and there's a monthly merchandise contest to win a t-shirt. Plus no ads. And additionally, I will host a monthly panel on Skype where we can talk about the show and true crime itself. Please sign up. There is much, much more where this came from. Hey guys, thanks for listening, and those of you who have read Misanthropology magazine, gratitude to you also. The October issue features an article about bad girls, both rebels and villains, female murderers and drug queenpins. Is queenpin a real word? Well, it should be. Last, but definitely not least, my old friend Donnorama graces the cover. She is none other than Toronto's premier queen of drag. In fact, she just might be the best in the world. RuPaul doesn't come up with such costumes and props. Donnorama is a real innovator. As previously mentioned, the URL where you can find Misanthropology for download is www.misanthropology.store, misanthropology.store. It costs $5, so it's cheap. And because it's not printed, it's environmentally friendly. That's always good, right? Thank you for your patronage and enjoy the show. Welcome to Human Monsters. Angus Sinclair was born in 1945 in Glasgow, Scotland, where he spent his childhood. His family were so impoverished that frequent starvation stunted his growth. He was underdeveloped in other ways, most notably his social skills. He had no friends. He was relentlessly bullied for being the smallest child in his class and for lagging behind his peers academically. After being bullied consistently over a long period, learned helplessness set in, and he became introverted and passive. It got to the point where he barely spoke in the presence of others. The trend continued in adolescence. The boys bullied him, and he never left a blip on the female sexual radar. Fenced into celibacy, his lack of a healthy sexual outlet resulted in a violent erotic pathology. He would fantasize about punishing the girls who ignored him. In these fantasies, he dominated and tortured them. One can forgive the lad for becoming misanthropic after facing so much rejection and condemnation from his teachers and peers. One teacher described him as not a simpleton, but of below-average intelligence. Ouch. Scottish people with Down syndrome were more dignified by external evaluation. Angus tried to play society's games by their rules, but he always lost, so he made up some of his own. To compensate for the lack of privileges only money can buy, he began stealing. Not just from stores, but from churches. The collection plate was passed directly into Angus Sinclair's greedy paws, and the parishioners were none the wiser. Only the church's bookkeeper got wise to the shortfalls. The church declined to press charges after they got the money back, but the police kept a paper trail. Sinclair committed a number of burglaries at the time, but there were many other offenders committing those crimes then, so it was hard for police to zero in on him. The police didn't want to waste much money and manpower on these crimes, so when he would get caught, they would rough him up a little and send him on his way with a warning. Angus dropped out of school. He never stood to gain from his studies and social interactions. He was told by his parents that since he was not going to pursue an education, he had to start working. With his meager qualifications, he was only able to land menial jobs. He got hired as a van boy at the age of 15. The position had him dropping off deliveries in other districts of Glasgow. One day at Cowcaddens, a borough of Glasgow, Angus's position brought him into a social housing complex. At one point, he discovered an 8-year-old girl playing by herself. There were no other people around. Somehow he persuaded her to accompany him to a hidden area. He pinned her against a wall and molested her. She screamed and cried throughout. Once he had gotten his kicks, he left her lying on the floor at a stairwell and went home. The police were notified about this incident and Angus was charged. Because he was still a juvenile, he would not face the same consequences as an adult sex offender, so he was sentenced to 3 years on parole. Were he to reoffend, he would be remanded to jail. The only lesson he learned from this experience was that he could avoid prosecution by intimidating his victims into silence. One day during the summer of his 16th year, he was outdoors when he spotted a neighbor child, 7-year-old Catherine. She was happily skipping down the street without a care in the world. He said, "Kathy, come here a second." He paid her to buy them both a chocolate bar from a store down the street. They walked the same direction back home. At his door, she gave him the chocolate and his change. He invited her in, but she declined. He took the tack of offering her relief from the sweltering heat. "Come on, it's roasting out there. Your chocolate will melt." Sensing that this was a harbinger of trouble, she began to run. He chased after her and grabbed her arm. She tried to wrest herself free, but he backhanded her. Her nose began to bleed down her face and to her neck, leaving streaks on her clothing. She was so stunned from the blow that he was able to yank her inside while she was disoriented. Once he had her inside, he grabbed her by the hair and yanked her to his room. She was screaming all the while. After entering his bedroom, he threw her down on the bed. She cried out, "Daddy, help me!" Angus pulled her skirt up and mounted her. He fondled her. Her screams were more anguished than ever. His hands, covered in blood, were planted on her mouth to shut her up. He reached down to the side of the bed and produced a ligature. It was made from a tire's inner tube. He wrapped it around her neck and choked her. As she kicked and flailed, he became aroused by her distress. In fact, he enjoyed it more than sex. He bore down on her with the rest of his weight and pulled harder on the inner tube. Once she choked out her final breath, Angus experienced an onset of joy the likes of which was new to him. He stared at her lifeless body for a minute, entranced. Realizing it was incumbent upon him to dispose of her body before he got caught, he went to the bathroom and washed himself with a face cloth. He returned to the bedroom and put the girl's clothing back on. He carried her out to the hallway. He nearly carried her outside, but there was no way nobody wouldn't notice that he was carrying a dead child in his arms. He walked to the landing leading to the basement. He threw her down the stairs with the intention of using the story of an accident to cover his tracks. This was not the basement of his home. The entire building used that basement. He assumed that whoever found her would presume that it was death by misadventure. Children take foolish risks all the time, and occasionally they result in injury or death. He left it up to everybody else to arrive at the same conclusion. Angus raced back to his room and tidied it up. If the police came knocking, he would know how to handle it. As an inveterate criminal, he knew how to lie to them. Angus heard a scream from the stairwell. He rushed over and found that two elderly women saw the corpse of Catherine at the bottom of the stairs in the basement. Both women were deeply shocked. Angus ran outside and used a public telephone to call for an ambulance. He said to the operator, "Catherine fell down the stairs. There is a little girl. She fell down the stairs in a clothes. She isn't breathing." Remembering that the police knew he was once charged for molesting an 8-year-old girl, it occurred to him that they would consider him to be the prime suspect in this crime. He packed some clothing into a bag and left home. The police caught up with Angus and interrogated him, though he admitted nothing. They likely saved his life, since Catherine's relatives were calling for his blood. His brother John convinced him to plead guilty. In jail, he would be relatively protected, at least from vigilantes on the outside. John distanced himself from Angus after the incident. Angus was charged as an adult. His mother was one of the only people to visit him in jail. While she was there, he said to her, "Why did I do it? Why did I do it, Mother? Why did I do that to her? I caused that little girl's parents so much grief. I've hurt them so bad. I don't understand. Why did I do it?" Angus was evaluated by psychiatrists while in custody. As they noted, he described aspects of his crime with a flat affect, as if he were talking about doing household chores. His IQ was tested and revealed to be at 80, which is below average. Though this did not designate him as developmentally disabled, it occurred to all parties that he might not have been intelligent enough to fully grasp the scope of his actions. One of the doctors pronounced that he had a psychosexual disorder and was at risk of committing similar crimes in the years to come. They recommended that he be kept isolated from the general population. Due to these factors and the melodramatic acting performance that accompanied his guilty plea, he was sentenced to a mere 10 years in prison. Much to his surprise, Angus Sinclair was not attacked in prison. Eventually, he befriended some of his fellow inmates, particularly the other sex offenders, and he proved capable of rehabilitation by becoming a model inmate. He even learned some new practical skills germane to painting and interior decoration. His knowledge base in another area grew. He received advice from other sex offenders on how to handle a sexual assault with greater efficiency and minimized risk of legal retribution. Con college indeed. He had graduated. After his release, Angus moved to Edinburgh and became employed in a position for which he trained in prison. He got his own apartment. He soon met Sarah Hamilton, the woman he would eventually marry. She was a nurse and instantly smitten with him. She moved in with him. She was glad to after living in a nurse's dorm at Edinburgh's Eastern General Hospital. They got married at the registrar's office. Their honeymoon was an amorous occasion, though his possessive behavior cast a dark pall over their erotic pursuits. Sarah wasn't troubled by it at the time. She was flattered and assured by his affections. Angus started his own home decor business while Sarah toiled away at nursing. As a result, they were able to elevate their financial standing and get a more opulent apartment. After the couple had been established for a year as husband and wife, Angus divulged his darkest secret to her: that he had molested and murdered an 8-year-old girl and spent years in prison for the offense. Sarah was horrified. He added some PR spin to make it sound like the murder was accidental. As luck had it, her brother had been in trouble with the law as a young man, so she chalked Angus's criminal behavior to immaturity and inexperience. Though he didn't tell her the entire truth, she interpreted his willingness to confess to her as a demonstration of the trust he placed in her. She was able to move past it. Angus and Sarah had a son named Gary, their only child. They were making such good money, Angus purchased an ice cream truck to supplement his income. He purchased a camper van and took up photography as a hobby. It is with this pursuit where Angus became extremely secretive. Nobody was ever allowed to see his photos. He was so secretive, he set up his own darkroom rather than risk having the images seen by a professional developer. In the meantime, he enjoyed selling ice cream to little girls throughout the neighborhood. Sarah was happy with her life of domestic bliss, and this enabled her to ignore some of the doubts she had about Angus's behavior and character. He was unfaithful to her. As a full-time employee and mother, she could not keep up with his sex drive. Angus used the camper van for one-night stands. Despite the constant sexual encounters, he remained insatiable and would turn to crime to find the satisfaction he was seeking. There was a rash of violent armed robberies in Glasgow at this time. Angus would attack first and snatch the victims' valuables while they were unconscious. He went to extremes. He caved in a woman's face with a claw hammer and followed up by snatching her purse. Another robbery had him lunging at a man from behind and cutting him with a hatchet, leading to the theft of his wristwatch and wallet. He became a pornographer in partnership with an elderly man known as Wee Eddie Cogtogno. Angus would trick or force young women to pose nude for Cogtogno. The girls in town were onto Wee Eddie, knowing he was nothing but a lecherous old creep. Angus was much more effective at convincing them that they were posing for art. Because the pornography they produced was underground, they weren't fussy about the age of the models, and child pornography was circulated throughout the city's sexual underground. Angus made some critical bank from these activities, so much that he was able to reduce the hours he spent painting houses and peddling ice cream. 37-year-old Frances Barker was on her way home from work and contemplating having a drink at the pub before retiring for the night. Angus Sinclair pulled up to her in his camper van. He invited her to ride with him and go for a drink. He charmed her with little effort. So soon they were off. Angus drove them out of town. He suddenly announced they were going to a country pub. He became flirtatious. Part of the motivation, he explained, was that his wife wouldn't know they were gallivanting about if they did it out there. Frances didn't want to get involved with a married man, so she intended to go home if he got fresh with her. Angus suddenly pulled over to the side of the road. He dragged her out of her seat and pushed her toward the back, where her bed was situated. She resisted, but he shoved her toward the bed. He tried to force her pants down as she struggled. To put a stop to that, he put his hand on her throat and constricted it until her hands went limp. He tore her pants off. He was breathing heavily now. Francis decided to let him do it so that they could get it over with. He pried her legs apart with his knee. He got on top of her. She clawed at him. Angus reached down and produced a spindle of string. He wrapped it around her hands. Francis closed her eyes in an effort to tune out the experience. Angus grunted and drooled as he molested her. She suddenly felt a rough section of rope pull across her neck. Angus wrapped a knotted rope of string around Francis's neck and pulled with all his strength. He continued to pin her down as he strangled her. He could not summon enough strength to kill her initially. With air returning to Francis's lungs, she nearly vomited on him, which was intentional. She was willing to use any resource to survive, or at the very least, convey her displeasure. He defiled her as she continued to fight for oxygen. He planted his entire weight on her. He strangled her with the rope of string again. This time it cut into her skin. Her eyes bulged. She tried in vain in her diminishing strength to find him off, but he was too strong for her. He arched his back and choked her one last time. She was finally and unequivocally dead. Angus drove Francis's body into a patch of bushes at the side of a road known as the local Lover's Lane. Her body was found 16 days later. Luck was on Angus's side. A known rapist named Thomas Young was charged and convicted for the crime. Young appealed, but it accomplished nothing, and he died in prison innocent of the crime. One night in the Hurdy-Gurdy pub in Glasgow, Anna Kenny was having a pint with her friend, Wilma Sutherland. Though the pub was known in town as a meat market, they weren't there to score some penis. Nevertheless, she met Angus Sinclair, and he worked his magic on her. They left the pub together. At one point, he brought her to his camper van. She knew what his agenda was all about, and she said, "Listen, mate, I've had a lot of fun tonight, but I've been at work all day and I'm knackered. I just want to get home for a kip. Nothing else. All right?" He smiled at her and said, "Hey, pal, don't worry about it. I'm not going to make you do anything you don't want to." He leaned toward her. She turned away, not wanting to kiss him. He wasn't going in to steal a kiss. He unlocked the camper van door. He said, "Look, I've only had a couple. How about I drive you home? Save you the bus fare." She stepped out and said, "No thanks, I've got my day ticket." He grabbed her arm gently. "Come on, love. I'm really enjoying your company. I'm sure you won't even take me out of my way." With the booze having seized upon her tongue, she said, "I'm no being funny. I'm just heading home. You're no getting to neck me in the car. You're no going to get anything from me. You understand?" He held up his hands and laughed. He said, "I'm just offering you a ride. No funny business. Scout's honor." Getting into the humorous swing of things, she said, "Aye, I can just see you in a Scout's uniform." She was persuaded. She got back in the car. Once she turned her back to him, the smile on his face dropped. It was displaced by something far more ominous. Angus drove them in the general direction of the district where she lived, but she soon realized he was driving in the wrong direction and heading out of town. She pointed this out to him. He said, "Sorry, love, I think I've made a wrong turn. Give us a minute, and we'll get back on track." 10 minutes later, they were out in the middle of no man's land. Anna became alarmed. She said, "I don't even recognize any of these streets. Where are you taking us?" He shrugged like there wasn't anything sketchy about this. She said, Oh, that's your game, is it? Drag me off to the middle of nowhere and try it on? To hell with that. Let me out here. I don't care where we are, I'll walk. Let us out. He flashed his smile to reassure her yet again. I can't go abandoning you in the middle of nowhere now, can I? Let us find the main road, and we'll get you back in no time. She wasn't buying it. Let me out of this bloody car, right now. The smile disappeared from his face. Something more sinister emerged. He was a predator, and she suddenly realized she had a target on her chest. Reinforcing this suspicion, Angus said, You aren't going anywhere, you mouthy wee bitch. Just shut up and sit still. She struggled to unbuckle her seatbelt in a frenzy. He planted his fist on her chest and pinned her to her seat. He grabbed one of her breasts and squeezed it so hard she squealed. He said, Shut your bloody mouth, or you'll get a lot worse than a wee squeeze. Anna began to cry unabashedly. He grabbed her shirt and twisted it until it was torn from her body. He ran his hand over her abdomen. She tried to squirm out of his grip, but with so little space in which to maneuver, there was little she could accomplish. He laughed uproariously. He pulled over to a short dirt track that ended at the gate of a field. When the camper van came to a stop, she tried to flee, but he caught her by what remained of her shirt and yanked her back in. He brought her to the bed and back, where he had spread a few lengths of knotted rope. Anna tried to escape once again, but he grabbed her shirt, tearing out a large patch from the back. He used what he tore from the shirt to make a ligature. Anna fell to the floor and was crawling along it. He tied the remains of her shirt around her ankles and bound her feet. He pulled her shoes off. As she was getting back on her knees, he ripped her skirt off. From there he pulled the sleeves of her shirt off. He removed her panties with so much force that the waistband left a bleeding incision behind. She whimpered as he took a close look at the blood. He wrapped the sleeve of her shirt around her throat and brought her down on the floor. She screamed, but he tightened the ligature until she could only gargle her distress. She was dead before he ejaculated. Angus drove Anna to a parcel of empty land close to the town of Campbelltown. He buried her in a shallow 2-foot grave. Her corpse wouldn't be discovered for 2 years. Hilda Macaulay went to the Plaza Ballroom. She had recently become a divorcee and was back on the market for something better. She caught the fancy of Angus Sinclair and returned it. She took him up on his offer to buy her a drink, and they got to talking. That led to dancing and flirting. At the end of the night, she said to him, "Have you got somewhere we can go?" Boy, was she singing his tune. As if a fire had been ignited within him, he took her by the hand and led her to his camper van. She almost laughed. He seemed too put together to live in a camper. Reading her signal loud and clear, he said, "She might not look like much, but this thing is great. You can go anywhere, anytime, and you never have to worry about where you are going to sleep. I drive it every weekend, all over the place. It's a holiday on wheels." He opened the door. She rolled her eyes, but she got in. He didn't have to twist her arm. She went directly to the bed. Angus, on the other hand, made a detour for the driver's seat. He said, "Just going to take us somewhere a bit quieter, where the police aren't going to come knocking on the windows and disturbing us." She laughed, saying, "Taking me to Lover's Lane, are you?" "I might just do that. Come on and sit up here with me. Keep me company." Angus pulled over to the side of the road near Port Glasgow. They got in back of the camper van on the bed. She discarded her clothing willingly. She shuddered at his touch. in a good way. Then he hit her on her jaw. The next thing she knew, he was on top of her, penetrating her. Her bra had been ripped off. He pawed her breast with so much strength it felt like he was crushing it. As she was about to scream, he hit her in the eye. She cried out in pain. He hit her over and over. He punched her in a rhythm, battering every square inch of exposed flesh. He wrapped his belt around one hand and struck her twice as hard with his hand. He punched her until he knocked her out. Cold. She wasn't just unconscious. She was dead. He had beaten her to death, and he couldn't have been more elated. He was so physically spent from this experience, he didn't bother to bury her body. He simply pushed her out the car and left her where she was. Hilda's body was found the next day by some children who were assigned to pick brambles from that side of the road. One night Angus went out to a pub called The World's End with his brother-in-law, Gordon, who idolized him and viewed him as the kind of man he wanted to be. Angus walked up to some girls and said, "There aren't many tables about. Do you girls mind if we share?" The girls appeared to be trepidatious about it. That was exactly how Angus Sinclair liked them, unsure of themselves and him. He wanted to make an impact, and he invariably did. Angus was wearing his work clothes. To convince them that he was just another working stiff and nothing besides, he said, "No funny business, girls. I've just been on my feet all day. I'll get the next round in, shall I? What are you having?" The girls were in their teens. At one point, Angus leaned over to Gordon and whispered, "Which one do you want?" "Both look good to me, mate." "You want both? You want to swap about?" "You think they'd go for that, do you?" Angus laughed at this. "You think it is up to them?" Later in the evening, Angus had driven Gordon and the girls to some rural location. The girls were so drunk and oblivious to what was really going on that one of them said, "Are we finally at the party?" Angus grinned. He unfastened his belt. He said, "We brought all the party you're going to need with us, darling. Now, which one of you lovely ladies wants to go first?" The girls laughed. There appeared to Angus to be a mocking tone behind it. He, on the other hand, was not amused. He said, "I said, which one of you wants to be fucked first?" Gordon could tell by Angus's demeanor that the party was over, and he was horrified. He had never seen this side of him. The violence was spilling out of Angus, and he hadn't thrown a single punch. The girls could see the same thing, and they were alarmed. He underlined his point. "Him or me? Which one do you want first?" One of the girls leapt at the door, but Angus grabbed her hair and tossed her onto the floor like she was a rag doll. The other girl sat beside Gordon. She was frozen with fear. Gordon grabbed her wrist to prevent her from doing anything reckless. Angus brought a length of cord out of his pocket. He tied up the girl who tried to flee. With what was left of the cord, he tossed it to Gordon and said, "Do her." Angus dragged the bound girl by the hair to the bed. She screamed all the way. Gordon could hear the sound of cloth being torn. He tried to tie up his girl, but was so unsettled by Angus's behavior, he found it difficult. The girl was crying. She tried to see what her friend was going through. He tried to remove the girl's clothing, but was unsuccessful. He gave up on this task and mounted her. Angus was now punching his victim every time she made a sound. Once she stopped screaming, he hit her until there was nothing but a guttural moan emanating from her throat. She was only semi-conscious, with drool, tears, and mucus running as a river down her face. He put her panties in her mouth to stifle the moaning. Gordon was contemplating the consequences of his and Angus's actions. The girl he was raping wasn't exactly savoring the experience either. When they looked over at Angus, they found that he was choking his victim with the cord. He was penetrating her and strangling her at the same time. This made Gordon feel ill, and his stomach turned. His victim began to cry, and he punished her by thrusting harder into her. Ultimately, he must have been sold on what Angus had in store for her, for he said, "See what is happening to her? It's going to do you next. You are next." She was crying more hysterically than ever. Angus's victim had died, and he lugged her out of the van and into a field. She was naked from the waist down. Gordon decided he couldn't let the other girl go. She would inform on him to the authorities. He also didn't want to experience what Angus would have in store for him if he defied his wishes. As the girl lay there, raped and bloodied, Angus got dressed. He wiggled his ass at Gordon as he put on his pants as a facetious gesture. Angus nodded toward the living girl and said, "We'll take that one someplace else. That way they might find one and not the other. Should just be a quick drive." Angus got in the driver's seat, followed by Gordon. Gordon said, "You know, Angus, I've never done anything like this before." "Aye, I could tell. Don't worry. I'm not going to make you finish her off. I'm not a complete bastard. I can see you're shaken. I'm just not used to this sort of thing, you know? Like, I appreciate everything you've done for me, and I appreciate getting a turn on the two lassies last night, but you pussying out on me, is that it? Is it all getting a bit too scary?" "Aye, that's right. I didn't sign up to kill any lassies. Just to have a good time." "That was a good time. Are you kidding? You're trying to tell me that wasn't the most fun you ever had?" "That is exactly what I'm trying to tell you." Angus pulled out onto the main road. He shrugged. "All right, then, I'm not going to make you do something you don't want to. And I'll not say anything about this to anybody." Angus said, "Of course you won't, you silly bastard. You are the accomplice to the murder of two young lassies. They'd have you in the nick for the rest of your life if you were daft enough to say anything to anybody. I know you, Gordy. You might not be the smartest lad in the world, but you're not that stupid." A silence fell over them. The only sound they heard beside the van's engine was the girl in back crying. Angus nodded toward her. "We'll be driving for a bit if you want another go on her. She isn't as pretty as she used to be, but I'm sure you could find something to do with yourself." "I'm fine, thanks. Not much face left for kissing, is there? You really did a number on her." Angus said with a smirk, "I told her not to scream. Is it my fault she wouldn't do as she was told?" They later arrived at a field. Angus strangled the surviving girl, though he had little strength to do it after the night's festivities. Instead, he bore down on her windpipe with all his weight until her life was extinguished. Angus and Gordon picked her up and dropped her in the field. Agnes Cooney was on her way home from having a drink with a friend at a social club when she walked to the curb to hail a taxi. No taxis came to a stop, but a camper van did. Angus opened the passenger door, smiled, and said, "You need a lift home, then?" Angus drove Agnes out toward a town called Lanarkshire. He was astonished that she took him up on his offer with no fuss whatsoever. Once Angus's camper van was beyond all vestiges of civilization, he pulled to a stop. The very intoxicated and ever-pliable Agnes didn't resist when he led her to the bed and back. Even when he tore her clothes off, she was still passive. He bound her with her clothes and raped her. Fear suddenly broke through the membrane of inebriation, and Agnes's eyes bulged from fright. He thrust into her with his hand over her mouth. He raped her so hard, her vagina began to bleed. Even this didn't satisfy him. He choked her with his free hand. Even that wasn't enough. He could not disentangle sex from violence. They had to be intertwined in order for him to come. He picked up a knife he had planted for occasions like this. He pulled it downward between her breasts, etching a red line in her skin. She panted through the panties that were stuffed in her mouth. He defiled her again, with the knife piercing her skin with every thrust. She began to scream, and that augmented his pleasure. There was one final step. He plunged the knife into her stomach, the knife acting as an avatar for his penis. His eyes rolled up into his head as he roared with an orgasmic rush. The pleasure increased tenfold with every slash of the knife. He was fucking her with the knife and feeling the sensation firsthand, as if the knife were only an extension of his body. When he came down from soaring so high, his moment of sobriety revealed that he had made a mess of the bed. The woman's blood and guts were strewn all over. He said, "Bollocks!" He realized he would have to replace both the mattress and the linens, and he was not a happy bloke. He enjoyed killing her, but the smell of offal and the stench of the material that was evacuated from her bowels was a real letdown. He started on the cleanup, but soon gave up and collapsed in a fit of laughter. He was so ecstatic, he couldn't be bothered to drag her somewhere to bury her. He simply opened the van door and kicked her out. Angus found it hard to return to his dreary workaday existence, so he made money by mugging people. As usual, they didn't get an opportunity to surrender their belongings. He would stab them or beat them unconscious and run. Mary Gallagher was 17 years old. She departed from her family home to visit some friends in her neighborhood. Angus Sinclair caught sight of her and stalked her until he caught up. He placed his knife against her back and put his hand over her mouth. He said, "Make another noise and you are dead. Do what I say and you get to walk away alive. Got it?" She nodded. Angus said, "Start walking. That way." Angus brought Mary to an empty lot where construction was due to begin. Once he was certain nobody could see them, he turned her around and pushed her to the ground. He said, "Strip." Mary cried as she took in the chilling visage of his knife. Angus said, "Take off your kit or you're never going home." Still crying, Mary removed her top. Angus grabbed her hair and pushed her head back. He pulled the straps of her bra off and yanked it down around her waist. She tried not to scream. He said, "Take off the trousers." She said, "Why?" "Why do you think? Take them off or I'll cut them off." She pulled them down part way. He grabbed her pants and tore them off. He dropped on top of her, pinning her to the rocky ground with all his weight. He knocked the wind out of her. She managed to slap him a couple of times as he struggled to remove her panties. She clawed his face. This time he screamed. She started to scream. She pummeled him in the head as he tried to penetrate her. He said, "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! You're ruining everything." She was shrieking now. In her hysteria, she ran her nails down his back, causing him to bleed. This was the last straw for him. Hoping to summon the attentions of a good Samaritan, Mary shouted, "Help! Help me!" Realizing this might get him arrested, it caught him off guard. She fought back even harder now, digging her fingers into his eye and biting his hand when he muffled her mouth. Angus went flaccid and fell backwards off her. He fell back onto something soft, her pants. He used them as a garrote and strangled her with what was left of his strength. She was a fighter. She would not allow herself to be strangled to death. He took his knife and cut a gash across her neck. Her blood sprayed all over his hands. After all this, she was still determined to fight. Her hands were balled into fists. He thrust the knife into her neck over and over until he pushed all his body weight onto the blade. When he felt the blade pry into bone, she went limp. He ran off, disappointed that her resistance had ruined the experience for him. A change came over Angus after the preceding incident. He suddenly lost his will and nerve to mug, rape, and kill people. His trepidation was like a lid placed on a boiling pot. He could only repress it for so long. Eventually it would erupt out of him, resulting in another act of senseless violence. He refrained from committing more murders, but he did use his ice cream truck to lure girls into isolated enclosures of apartment complexes, where he would rape them. One ruse he frequently employed was to tell them he lost his dog and needed them to help him find it. He would go as far as to carry a leash with him to establish credibility. These girls' ages ranged from 6 to 14. It happened so often he lost count of how many girls he molested and or raped. Years later, he told police the number could have ranged between 50 and 500. One of these victims came forward after Sinclair was arrested, and his case attracted media exposure. She said he approached her in his car outside her school. He tried to persuade her to get in the car. He was well known to police in the area, so he wore a disguise. The disguise: a sundress and pancake makeup. He addressed her in a falsetto voice. He was trying to pass as a woman, essentially. The girl wasn't fooled, but she figured that a man who would dress in drag was likely harmless. She nearly got in the car, but her mother intervened in time, and Angus drove away. Sinclair was lucky for the time being. Though most of the rapes and molestations were reported to the police, investigators didn't have enough evidence to charge him. Angus's relationship with Eddie Cotogno deteriorated. Eddie was paying him less and less money for his photos, with his explanation being that the quality had diminished. Angus wanted Eddie to teach him how to develop color photos in the darkroom. One day the men got into a heated argument. Angus lost his temper and beat Eddie to death. Even in the hour of Eddie's demise, Angus was still vindictive. With satisfaction having eluded him, he took all of Eddie's child porn pictures and tossed them around his corpse. He wanted anybody who found his cadaver to know what the man was really up to pre-mortem. Still, with the body only freshly killed, there was an abundance of evidence for a pathologist to discover. Bearing this in mind, Angus doused the man's living room with the chemicals that were used to develop photographs, which are highly flammable. He set the house on fire. Angus's life fell into a routine throughout the 1970s. He decorated homes. He sold ice cream to children and molested some of his customers. 1979 was the year when police showed up at his door with a warrant for his arrest. Because he had been arrested before, he knew not to admit to anything without first ascertaining what the police knew. He had been mentored by seasoned criminals in prison, so he knew what he was doing now. After the police told him what he was being charged for, he made a full confession. He must not have been charged with murder, for he was released from prison by the middle of 1980. By June 1982, he was haunted by his nefarious desires, and they got the better of him. Sure enough, he tried to lure a girl into an enclosure for the purposes of sexual abuse. When she got wise to his agenda, she ran away screaming. It turned out she had heard several stories from others about that kind of scenario. The same day, he lured a 7-year-old girl in a bathing suit to another enclosure. He molested her, and she reported the incident to police. Later that same month, a 6-year-old girl reported to the police that she was dragged into an enclosure and raped. She remembered her attacker's face very well. Another girl who was assaulted had a breakdown in art class because the teacher opened a canister of turpentine and she could smell the chemical on her attacker. Another victim noted the turpentine smell. The police showed these girls photos of offenders. There were 12 victims in all, and they all identified Angus Sinclair as the assailant. Sinclair was arrested at his home once again. During interrogation, Angus denied all the accusations. At one point, Sarah showed up. The police let her speak with Angus alone, but unbeknownst to both of them, the recording equipment was left running. Sarah said, "Did you do it?" "No, of course not. How could you think? How many of them? How many times did you do it?" Sarah was in no mood to tolerate his evasion. "You are going to admit what you've done. You're not going to drag this family through a court case. You're not going to drag all those kiddies into court to point at you and say you did it. Just admit it. Admit it, you coward." Unwilling or unable to maintain eye contact, he said, "All right." True to his word, when the police returned, he said, "I was lying before. I did it. I did all of it. I've lost count of how many times I've done it. I've done so many of them that I can't remember all that I've done. If you can find out when and where, I'll tell you if I did them or not. Is that fair?" Angus Sinclair was convicted on 3 counts of rape and 9 counts of sexual assault that year. The presiding judge, Lord Cameron, said during the sentencing phase of the trial, "The penalty for rape is entirely discretionary and without limit. I have considered very carefully whether a limit should be placed on the extent of the penalty, and I have decided there is only one limit, namely, your life." Life sentences for rape were uncommon in Scotland, but Angus Sinclair was deemed a dangerous offender who posed an unacceptable risk to the community, especially its children. Though his relatives visited him, Sarah never spoke to him again, though she never divorced him. DNA later linked Sinclair to the murders of which he hadn't been convicted. Though Angus Sinclair would have been eligible for parole at the age of 106, he died at the age of 73 on March 11th, 2019. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.